Welcome to Wildlife Outdoors with your host, Russell and Jose. If you have a passion for conservation of the outdoors, or you're enjoying a calming hike in the mountains, an exhilarating kayak trip on the river, feeling a fish on the end of your line, cooking on an open flame in a primitive campsite, or stalking big game, just waiting for the perfect shot, you're in the right place. So put on your boots and polarized sunglasses and come along for the ride.
Welcome to Wildlife Outdoors. Today we're joined by Aaron Kindle, a lifelong hunter, angler, and one of the nation's leading voices for public land conservation. As the Director of Sporting Advocacy at the National Wildlife Federation, he brings a deep understanding for why keeping public lands in public hands matters now more than ever. Welcome to the show, Aaron. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. I'm doing
Yes,
awesome.
sir. I'm happy to have you on.
Yeah, this is going to be a good conversation.
Oh, for sure. So, with you being from National Wildlife Federation, I guess the listeners already know that this is most likely going to be about public lands and everything going on in the government right now. So, before we get into that, you grew up out west and stuff like that, being an avid hunter and avid angler. Can you share a little bit of your story and your background and how you grew up?
Sure. I lived in a small town in central Wyoming for most of my until I was about in the 8th grade. And then I moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, and my dad took a different job, but have lived in the West my entire life. Spent about 7 years in Montana, had a couple short stints in Utah. So I lived essentially right in the heart of the Rockies my entire life. And, definitely shaped my life in a lot of profound ways. I think maybe the most important way in my life was my dedication to public lands. Public lands are, they're just about as integral as breathing for me. I live, my property right now touches BLM land. I spend, hundreds of days every year hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, everything you can think of. So it really set me on a path, the ability to be outside. And I think there's a lot of Americans who that happens to, a lot of people I know, and then you find yourself thinking, how am I going to get outside next time? Or where am I going to live? Or where could I move to get closer and more access and those kinds of things. So, it definitely shaped my personal values, my family's values. My kids love public lands. They love fishing. They love hunting. This is their life too. And I think a lot of that was shaped just by my wife and I's a very conscious choice to be near public lands and the outdoors as much as we possibly could.
Yeah, it sounds like it definitely sent you on a trajectory on where you're at now, which is, seems like a good place to be for sure. So, how do you think your personal background can help people understand why these policy changes matter to the everyday outdoorsman?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about policy changes that are happening right now or proposed to be happening. For folks who might not know, we've seen an amendment in the House version of the reconciliation bill a few weeks back, offered that would have sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000, sold or exchanged 500,000 acres of public lands in Nevada and Utah. And, for some folks, they may hear that and go, there's 650 million acres. Maybe that's not such a big deal. And I think on its face, average people can go, yeah, maybe so. That's not a big deal. But I'll get to why we have such heartburn with it. And then here recently, we've seen a Senate version that's much worse, that basically mandates the sale of public lands. And it mandates about 2 to 3 million acres of public lands for sale, or at least it's interesting to say, that's what would be available for sale. So it mandates that some sales do happen. It puts about 2 to 3 million acres on the table for sale. And it reduces a lot of the ways that the public has typically been able to engage and, some of the process for selling public lands. And I think it's important, a lot of people go, oh, government and process. And, we all kind of get weighed down by that. You go to the DMV, you go to do a lot of other things and you're not in love with slow government process. I get it. I think the difference with public land is once they're gone forever. You don't get them back. You lose access, you lose opportunity. you kind of took that from future generations, that particular piece of public land. And the issue with these is they're mandates. They say you have to do this,
Mm-hmm.
and they really remove a lot of the public's opportunity to be engaged at all. They say you have to do it quickly, and the public doesn't get that chance to engage. So then for guys like you and I who hunt or fish or hike or live near these, we lose our opportunity to both use them and even say what's going to happen. And I think the other really interesting thing about this, there's two really interesting things. One, when we see those peripheral kind of around community in the hill public lands of the West sold, those are typically sold to very wealthy individuals. It's not like regular Joes and Janes getting these pieces of property. That's, you've been out West. I certainly live out West. When I look around town, the lands, the houses up in the hills on those lands are not the kind of lands that regular Joes can afford typically.
Yeah.
And so we've heard this, affordable housing piece is what the key sponsor, Mike Lee, has been talking about. We don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
We do recognize affordable housing and, lack of housing is an issue. Sure, we get that.
Yeah.
But these things, I'm also a planning commissioner. These types of houses, we talk about these all the time in my county. They need septic. They need wells. That's not the type of thing that you develop condensed affordable housing with. We actually are very nervous about those in our county because that drains water resources. It's tough on, having septic systems out there. So there's those issues, right? There's all of those
Mm-hmm.
things. And then also we have what we call FLPMA, the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, which has been around since 1976. It's almost 50 years old. It was a bipartisan deal when it was passed. It's worked great. There are some public lands for sale right now, particularly in the BLM, which the FLPMA covers. The BLM is Bureau of Land Management. And there's a process for that. And every field office, BLM has a bunch of field offices all around the West. They have all, through their resource management plans, we call them RMPs. I'm sorry, I'm giving you acronym soup here, but we call them RMPs. They've identified what they call land suitable for disposal. And they've done that for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's an inholding, right? There'll be a 2,000 acre ranch with a 50 acre parcel of BLM right in the middle of it. Nobody can use it anyway. Mm-hmm. Maybe that is appropriate for disposal, right? But the BLM's done analysis and said that makes sense to sell that piece of land because you can't use it, doesn't provide wildlife habitat, can't access it, different reasons, right? And then they put those up for sale. And it's a very public process. Before they do that, you or me or anybody who lives there can come and offer comment and say, hey, here's the difficulty that might create for me, or here's a sensitive wildlife habitat there, or any of the other different variables that might come into play there. So we have a really sound process that's been working for a long time to sell public lands when there's those limited circumstances it makes sense. The other big deal is through the Federal Lands Transaction. I don't know this acronym right off the top of my head very well. I'm sorry. Federal Lands Facilitation Act, something like that. FLTFA is the acronym. And through FLTFA, whenever those public lands are sold, that money goes into a fund that works on things like access and conservation and puts it back onto the land. The difference between this Senate bill is that it would take that land and that money and put it into the Treasury. So that's removing that resource from already strapped agencies, that have trouble and don't have enough resources to manage these lands a lot of the time anyway. It's removing even more from it and removing the public process and selling lands that will likely just be, mega mansions that none of the rest of us will ever be able to access again. So those are the three big problems with it that we see, and why this one has drawn the ire of, if you look out in the world, you've got every major sporting organization denouncing this. You've got conservation organizations. It's amazing. We've heard from Senate offices and House offices. They've never seen anything like this when it comes to public lands. So
and it's crazy. So many people are crossing aisles to help each other and meet up for the same cause. But before we get into that, I would like to kind of dig more into, all the the issues that you mentioned and kind of dig more into them. So one of them was, affordable housing and stuff like that, which is great. Yes, you're right. We absolutely do have a problem in this country with affordable housing. We have a lot of unhoused people. But like you said, that land up there is high dollar land. You're not going to have an average Joe, an everyday person going up there and buying property. And even if it was affordable, I haven't seen anything stating that they're going to stop corporations from buying the property and stuff like that. And there's a lot of times in this country, and I think that probably has a lot to do with why housing is so unaffordable, is because there are corporations buying single family homes and single family properties and stuff like that, and they're paying above listing value because they want access to it. And so that's a snowball effect where, okay, this corporation is going to buy it for a set amount, and then they have to rent it out for this much amount because they have to get a profit on it because they paid more than asking price. And if they allow that there, if they don't put anything in this bill saying that we're not going to allow that, then that's just harming the everyday American. And there's numerous ways that they can, work on affordable housing for Americans rather than taking stuff from us. It's like we're not even benefiting from them taking the lands from us. And then tying from that into the money going straight into the treasury, that's not helping us as outdoorsmen or conservationists either. That's going straight to, the government's pocket, which they're saying, oh, well, it's going to help cut down on the national deficit. Well, after everything's sold, you're probably looking at maybe less than 1% of the deficit. So is that really worth taking our public lands that we've fought for? I mean, in my opinion, it's not. But there's a lot of things that a lot of people are putting out there. And they're just saying, oh, well, this is why we're doing it, and this is how it's going to help you. But I may be blind, but I haven't seen anything how it's going to benefit us.
Yeah, you're touching on a lot of the points we've been talking about. One of the things about affordable housing projects is that they need to be connected to infrastructure, right? And a lot of these peripheral BLM, Forest Service type lands around these communities aren't connected to city water, city sewer. Mm-hmm. They don't have public transportation. So if you take folks that might need affordable housing and you put them away from, the core of the community, then transportation becomes an issue. You start stacking on other issues. How do you get sewer and water there? How do you get emergency services there? So you have the first part that we just stand by and live, right? That we don't want these sold anyway, because they're our birthright as Americans, and we care about these lands. But then you get into the nuts and bolts of the policy. This is not the appropriate place for affordable housing. And that's why we think it's more of a guise, right? It's you use that because we all kind of inherently feel like, oh yeah, we need affordable places to live for folks. We get that. And so it makes it sound a little better. But when you really break down the policies and how they would come into effect, it doesn't make any sense. And so, there's a lot of things we could do to reduce debt. There's a lot of things we could do to improve affordable housing situations. This doesn't fit the bill on either one of them, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it seems like they kind of put it in there like a backdoor way. It was obviously voted down previously in the House for, a much smaller section of land, and now it's much more land. And they worded it the way, like you mentioned earlier, that it's not going to go through FLPMA. It's not going to be able to have public input to speak on these things. It's going to bypass all that, and the money's going to go to the Treasury. So it's like even more backhanded than what the other bill was that got voted down. So
there's no mandate. Shady. Yeah, there's no mandate for this to go to housing even, right? It allows the Secretary of the Interior or Secretary of Agriculture to nominate these lands, but it also says interested parties can nominate these lands. It doesn't, it kind of talks about what could be used, but it doesn't prohibit. And when you look at laws and the way Congress writes laws, if it doesn't prohibit it, it could happen, right? So we imagine things like foreign entities even being able to buy this, much less even a wealthy American building it for a nice house. What if someone from a different country wants to build a golf course or any other type of thing, right? It doesn't prohibit those things. So, there's that's one of the things that's really open-ended on this that makes this a dangerous deal. And it's a precedent that could be set that really changes the way public lands are managed and sold, and, the transactions that happen on them. And that's why you see the community just roundly rejecting these kinds of things, is because it's bad policy, and ultimately regular folks lose and you can't get it back.
Absolutely. There's no more land being made, and the government's not known for taking stuff and then giving it back.
Yep.
So, but yeah. So as a lifelong hunter and angler, like, how do you see public lands connecting people? So like, we're talking about average Americans, everyday Americans. So how do you see the lands connecting people to the outdoors and helping in like rural communities and stuff like that?
Well, man, I could go on forever. They're integral, right? I mean, if you don't have access to someplace, you can't go, for one. And then if you do have access to place, it just kind of opens the door to a lot of different things, right? I mean, there's a reason we have lots of programs to get kids outdoors, right, away from screens, right? And then
Yeah.
what does that do in your life? If you fall in love early, we know that. You and I both play a lot of sports. Why do we do that? Because we started as a kid and we fell
Yep.
in love with it, right? It's the same with public lands, right? If you have a relative or a friend or a neighbor who took you fishing when you were 5, your likelihood to be a fisher person when you're 50 is greatly increased. And because in the United States, we have this amazing privilege of 650 million acres of public lands, it's something that lots of us do, right? I don't know if you're familiar with some of the models in Europe. In Europe, if you want to hunt, for instance, you have to both pay to get access to the land, and then you pay per pound for the animal that you harvested, like it's meat at a
Really? I
grocery
didn't know
store,
that.
right? So in some countries, so think about that compared to what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a situation by which we can, for relatively affordably, get a hunting tag and go out to these millions of acres and try to harvest the animal and bring home lots of meat. That's a different kind of a thing. Then you take rural communities, as you mentioned, all those rural communities that would be out in the boonies that, do have visitors that come to those restaurants, those hotels, those mom and pop shops, the auto mechanic. If there wasn't people visiting, what would those communities look like? Would they have jobs?
Yeah.
Would there be opportunity for residents there to be entrepreneurial and create a business? I mean, I know towns that that are on the other side of that, and they're drying up and going away. So I think a lot of our economy, has to be diverse. There's times when there's reasons to extract resources. There's times when there's reasons to preserve them. But this outdoor recreation economy, this ability to, if you have these open landscapes there in perpetuity, there's this economic driver that also fulfills us in many different other ways.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the outdoor recreation roundtable estimates that these lands fuel roughly 1.2 trillion US dollars in recreation economy. So, not even speaking from, just the feelings and people getting out and connecting with nature, but economically, it makes sense to keep these as recreation lands because that's what they're used for. That's a huge industry. $1.2 trillion. Granted, that's not just these lands on their own, but just in general, that's a lot of money going into the US economy, especially in local economies and rural economies and stuff like that. That's people's livelihood. So the implications of taking these lands away from those rural communities where they don't have the means to survive like you can in the inner city is just it's insane. And then you have a lot of people voting on these things that aren't outdoorsmen or that didn't grow up in nature and they live in the inner cities, which there's nothing wrong with that, but they're making these decisions and it's not evenly yoked based on population of the country or people that like to recreate. And then on top of that, they're kind of putting it in the back door. And it's just, the implications are crazy for especially smaller rural economies.
Yeah, they really are. And then we're not even talking about other things like wildlife habitat or drinking water. The
Exactly.
Western public lands provide drinking water for about 80 million people. What does that look like if you start privatizing a bunch of that? Well, the way people manage their land without public input, that's a lot different than how an agency that needs to consider all the public implications, how that, through the National Environmental Policy Act, which I know we're going to talk about, NEPA, it requires you to analyze all of those different things. So then you get an opportunity as a member of the public to provide input. You have to analyze the different alternatives. They always create multiple alternatives: doing nothing, doing a little bit, doing a lot. So the public and everybody else can think about the implications of doing these various actions. And so that's some of the ways that keeping these lands in public hands will allow us to kind of have a more sustainable situation in perpetuity, right? If we take care of these lands and we continue to have access to them, those businesses, those other things that rely on these lands should be able to be there forever.
Yeah. And speaking on implications, you briefly mentioned, wildlife habitat. So just think about what this is going to do to migration corridors and stuff like that. So it's not only just the land that's going to be sold, there's migration corridors that species utilize and it could be detrimental to the populations of certain animals that are in that area when they sell off certain lands. And so that's another thing that it's going to be affecting ecology, which is a big thing that, we've spent years and years and years studying on how to properly manage and conserve these species. And doing something like this could actually, be a huge issue with migration corridors. Like the National Wild Turkey Foundation explains that there's vital habitats for wildlife and cornerstones of our hunting heritage, cherished spaces like held in trust for all Americans. And it's not only people that live there, not only those economies, which are majorly important, but people travel there for hunting, and that hunting, the money that's made goes back into the conservation of these species. And if you start dwindling that down, then you got to look at the future of what these species, if they can't migrate, they can't utilize those corridors to get where they're going, then, you're going to see populations start declining. And there's so many different things that can be caused by these lands being sold.
Yeah, lots of degrading impacts, right? If folks, I don't know, in Arkansas, if you're familiar, but there's a famous pronghorn migration called the Path of the Pronghorn. And if you take a look at that someday, but one of the famous developments within that, and I say developments in kind of the history of how that was all known and conserved, was there was one landowner that was right at a bottleneck where the pronghorn had to go through, and they worked out a deal with that landowner. But for instance, if that would have been owned by somebody who wouldn't work out a deal, it's literally a bottleneck. If they can't go through there, they can't migrate. That population dwindles precipitously from that one landowner. Now extrapolate that across the whole West and all these places that have a potential to be sold under this legislation. We don't know what that means. We're starting to look about where the migration pathways could potentially be. But one of the other big issues with this piece of legislation we're talking about is they didn't provide a map. The maps that we've all seen out there are generated by others saying, you're saying these kinds of lands are eligible, so here's what we think you're talking about. They're not actually the lands provided by the architects of the legislation. So again, kind of bad policy, right? If I was saying to you, hey, I'm going to sell, 50% of your land or 10% of your land, you'd want to know exactly what that land was, right? You'd want to know dang sure what land, what values were there. And, if you had timber, if you had water, if you had all those things, that'd be the first thing you do is do a full scale analysis of the values on that landscape. So it's kind of another part of why it's problematic, but wildlife is certainly something that obviously we care about very deeply, that we're concerned with here. We've learned so much about wildlife. Winter range, when Representative Zinke was a Secretary of the Interior, he also did SSO 3362, which was all about conserving winter range. Winter range is these places right next to communities that have been developed with houses and, recreational type amenities that we've finally over the last handful of years started to acknowledge. Those critters have to have that space in order to carry out their life history and have healthy herds and abundant herds. And if we're acknowledging that through many different policies, and then we just kind of come right over the top of that and say that could be sold, it sets back a lot of work, and it really kind of flies in the face of a lot of things we've learned and ways that we know we can conserve these awesome herds and these migration routes. And so yet again, the more you talk about this, you can kind of just keep opening up another problematic can of worms with this piece of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched briefly on NEPA. So I'd like to kind of get more into that. And so, just backing up a little bit. So the bill itself is called HR1, right? Which is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is what everybody's calling it. So it contains provisions that rewrite NEPA and other laws. So can we dig a little bit more into that and what you know on that?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a lot about at least some about what NEPA is. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and it essentially says that anytime you're going to take an action that has the potential to disturb or alter federal public lands, there's a process for doing it, right? You first have to say, hey, you notice it in the Federal Register. Here's what we're going to be talking about. Everybody can go read that and say, what is that? What does it look like? And then you have to do either an environmental assessment if it's a smaller scale project, or an environmental impact statement if it's going to be large, consequences on the landscape. And then through that, they'll do a draft of that, right? And then the public gets its first chance to take a look at that. And they'll often do public meetings, and the agency officials will be there explaining what's happening and why they need to do it. And there's some back and forth. And then once they've done the draft and taken public comment, they come back with another draft, a final environmental impact statement, and they show you that and see how they've integrated the different changes. So I think the biggest thing that especially just a regular Joe or Jane trying to think about NEPA is out there is it's the way that you daylight and give opportunity for the public to look at what happens on federal public lands. And to say, here's what I want to happen, or here's a value that's there that matters to me. Or, there's even some, mechanical type of stuff like, hey, if you close that road, it'd take 30 minutes to go clear around to this other place. Or, if you do that, you can't have access to this bridge, or, lots of different things like that takes not just the professional analysis, but takes the community to come in and say, here's what we think about this. And there's been a lot of opportunity, a lot of trying to break NEPA down over the years, right? You can imagine if you're someone who wants to develop some large scale mine or housing development or anything else on public lands, or wants to get a hold of that public lands and develop it, you don't want a lot of that. That's business cost, right? That slows you down. That does a lot of different things. And I would say that, NEPA does take a long time. And that's also, I think a fair thing to say. Does it take too long? I think these processes shouldn't be done quickly, but it might take too long in some cases. Are there ways we can improve it? Sure. Are there ways we can improve public land management? Sure. That's that's the, the basket we should be putting our eggs into, in my mind. It's a real distraction when we go away from doing the things that need to be done and start talking about getting rid of them altogether. Right. And it's what I would say is one of my critiques of Senator Lee, who's the architect of this, is he does a lot of complaining about what's happening on the landscape and how the agencies are just so terrible. And he comes up with, plans to just get rid of them then. Right. And one of the other things we've seen in Congress, unfortunately, over about the last 25 years, is there's this, what I call a fairly nefarious scheme, really, to defund the agencies, right? Take away more of their budget and resources, and then at the same time use that as the fodder to say, look, they're not doing a great job. We should defund them some more. And you can see where that goes, right? It gets to be to where they're understaffed, they're under-resourced. Now we've just seen the biggest swipe at that in history since the advent of the Forest Service and the BLM. Massive layoffs of staff have happened. So to me, that's just an extension of what's been happening. Defund, destaff, and then say, see, look, it's broken, so we got to get rid of it. So that's a really problematic kind of development that's happened over time. And I think, the other thing I would add to it too is we've seen fires get bigger and hotter, and more of the resources of those agencies go towards fire. Right. And so it's not just that they're defunded from the appropriations level in Congress, but also where the money's being used. More percentage of it's been has gone to fire. So you're getting into a position where, if you were a business owner and that was the situation for your business, and you were still expected to churn out the exact same product with, 30% less staff and 30% less funding, that would put a big strain on you. And in the end, I think it's only natural to think that, the product would suffer. And I think we're feeling some of that. We all know, I can go out and show you some BLM lands right now that have been overgrazed and mistreated, and fences are down and all kinds of different things that could use some love. And we're all for giving them that love. But that doesn't mean that we should get rid of the BLM or we should get rid of those
Yeah.
public lands.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that just opens up a whole other can of worms in terms of like ballot biology, to where you're going to have people that don't know anything about wildlife or ecology voting on what they believe is best for animals. There's been numerous cases throughout history where animals have almost gone extinct due to anthropogenic reasons. People doing what they think is best or trying to control situations and not really having the knowledge to manage or conserve these species. And unfortunately, if this trend keeps going, it's going to end up turning into that. There's going to be a lot of people thinking they're doing something good, out of ignorance on the situation, that, oh, well, if we can't hunt this animal, or if we don't do anything for this animal, it's going to make a difference and they're going to survive because we're not out there killing them. And it's like, well, that's not really how it works. And all these departments of natural resources actually know the science behind all this stuff and have spent years and years and years developing plans in order to benefit these resources that we have, to keep them available for generations to come. But some people just don't know that, and that's not really against them, especially people that don't recreate outdoors. Like, it's understandable that they wouldn't know about it, but at the same time, you can't be having people like that voting on Americans' behalf for stuff that they really don't know about, just voting on emotions rather than the science.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Just make a corollary and say, do we want you and me voting on how pilots should operate? No, we're not pilots. If we did that,
Probably not.
That'd be dangerous, right? We want professionals
Exactly.
to be the ones who manage wildlife. There's a lot of dedicated wildlife professionals I'm, know and am aware of, and I want those folks doing this. They went to school for that. They study this stuff every day. And I know a lot of
Yeah.
people who voted for certain things that, don't know anything about that thing, but they
Yeah.
just wanted it. So, and that extends beyond wildlife, right? A lot of ballot initiatives, people vote for them because they just feel like they want that, and they may not know the facts about anything. So,
Exactly.
we like representative democracy. We like people to have a say in, how things turn out in their world. But there's also a lot of very specific subject areas where you need professionals, and you need people who dedicate their lives and their time and think of this stuff every day to make those decisions. And you could run a ballot initiative that says we want to reintroduce the jackalope, right? You literally could. There's no jackalopes ever. There never has been, but you could run it, and if you got enough signatures on there, they would put that on the ballot, right? So
Yeah.
that's an example of anything crazy can happen when you get enough people voting for it. So leave it to the experts.
Absolutely. So speaking on that, there's other proposals within HR 1 and related to reconciliation bills that would force sales of these lands and whatnot. But these sales, the way that it's worded, almost seems like they could likely happen with no hearings, no debate, no public input, and just completely bypassing FLIPMA. So, what is due process, and how can public input, why is it so crucial when the government considers selling these lands, repurposing public lands and stuff?
Yeah, we talked about it a little with NEPA, because essentially NEPA is what would happen normally. FLIPMA is a little bit different. FLIPMA is a process specifically for disposing already identified BLM lands. But if it were on the Forest Service, which a good chunk of these lands are on the Forest Service, normally you'd have to go through a public process. Again, here's what we're going to do. Here's why we're going to do this. And what do you think about this? And so folks like hunters and anglers and recreationists and anybody that has it in local businesses could come in and say, this is how it's going to impact me. Oh, hey, look, they're over there. This elk migration was cut off because there was a big blowdown of timber. So now they're coming over here. These professionals we talked about, they know a lot of that stuff, but with big wildfire, with different things like that, conditions are changing a lot, and they do need those local folks to come in and help them make the best decision. Excuse me. One of the big issues here is it's mandated. It's within 60 days of passing this bill here in the Senate, sales would begin, right? That's probably not enough time to analyze this. And it's unclear exactly where they're talking about, right? So it's hasty. It's mandated. It's we don't know exactly what lands they're talking about. We know kind of the basket they could pick from, but we don't know what's exactly in that basket. So those are the kinds of things that really, cause a problem. And, if you take FLTMA, for instance, one of the reasons it's such good policy is, right, it allows all those things. You have to sell it for fair market value. It goes back to the land. And then also, it allows for sale up to 2,500 acres. It's not nothing. And then in addition to that, if it goes over 2,500 acres, Congress will get a chance to say whether or not they want that to happen. So you have another little piece of checks and balances if you're starting to get into that bigger acreage type of piece. So what is good governance? I think we all think checks and balances, right? That's why we don't like dictatorships. That's why we don't like, we
Right.
need the different pieces to check the other pieces. And so that's why FLTMA was created, right? Is so that if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And we're going to get the appropriate folks thinking about it, and the appropriate public process. So that's why this just circumnavigates that completely and says we're not doing any of that. So that's a huge piece.
That's insane to me. So speaking on checks and balances and bipartisan bills and stuff like that, so something crazy has been happening with this to where we've seen politicians from both sides of the aisle come together. Like you said, we got Zinke and we got Vasquez, and they plan to launch a bipartisan public lands caucus focused on protecting lands and access. So how do you think sportsmen's values help bridge, the party divides and how they're coming together to do this?
Yeah, I think they're not partisan. That's what's great, right? Everybody, there's not a person on earth I know that doesn't love to sit on a precipice and look out over a beautiful rolling valley and forest with critters in it. I mean, that's pretty much universal. Everybody loves those things. It's not a Republican or a Democrat thing. I'm really proud to see what Representative Zinke and Vasquez did. They did indeed launch the Public Lands Caucus. And I'll tell folks on NWF Outdoors, our podcast, we just had Representative Vasquez today, and that episode will be out tomorrow. So, we're fairly educated on what he's up to, and he talked today about it being a working caucus, meaning they're there to try and form solutions. He talked about access. He talked about improved management, some of the same things we've talked about. Zinke and Vasquez also have introduced the Public Lands and Public Hands Act, right? Which is a piece of legislation that says you can't do essentially what these other bills are doing. It says we're going to keep these here, except for in the small scale cases like we're talking about under FLTMA and BLM land. So it's a bipartisan. Let's get out there and let's look at the issues on the ground. Let's create solutions that work for people, that work for rural communities. I think it's a great development, and it's bipartisan, and that's the kind of thing we need. We need to go look at how we can help improve the management of these lands, how we can help maintain these lands, restore these lands. They're the goose that laid the golden egg. They deserve us taking a good hard look at how we can keep them intact, and they're, like we talked about, in perpetuity for our use. It's a very uniquely American thing. You talk to people around the world, it's the envy of the world. You guys just have millions of acres. You can just go out and you can drive your car and just pull over and camp. I mean, that is literally foreign to most of the world. They don't know what that means and what it looks like. That's something we should protect very, very deeply.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then if you start developing these lands, I mean, the fact that they're public lands, they're not heavily developed. You got to think about, the healthy soil, the healthy water, the healthy air that helps us thrive as human beings and helps, wildlife thrive. And then you have other countries where they don't have that. And you just think about the health of their people. You think about the health of their wildlife. And like you were saying, I didn't even know it was like that in Europe, where you paid per pound for whatever you harvest and stuff. Like, you think about some of the, people here that can't afford that. And a lot of people survive on only animals that they hunt and only things that they grow. And you got to think about what that's going to do, selling off all these public lands. And you're going to have other people that would normally go in these Western lands that are going to be trying to harvest animals elsewhere, which could then affect the people that actually need their lands. And so it's a huge snowball effect. But it's crazy because I grew up in Texas, and Texas is 98% privately owned, and they have public lands, and there are a couple public lands, but a lot of the times when people are referring to public lands in Texas, it's private lands that's being leased by Texas Parks and Wildlife for you to recreate on. And so I didn't know anything about public lands until I moved to Arkansas. And, you can go out to the national forest and just hike through the forest or find a trail or go camp or go hunt, and use it to access the lakes and rivers. And it's just crazy. And I was unaware of that until I started talking to people and started doing stuff when I moved here. I was like, this is amazing. Like this, not we pay taxes to maintain this land, but like it's available for literally anything. Like I could just go out there and, if it's within season and I have my permits, I can just go hunt just out in the woods. Like I don't have to go to this specific boundary piece of land that is leased by somebody else. And it's like, oh, you can't cross that boundary because then you're on their private property. No, we have the Washita National Forest here, which is like hundreds of thousands of acres that we can just go recreate on, go camping, go hiking, go hunting. And it's crazy that I didn't even realize that until recently. And so I feel like there's probably a lot of people out there that don't really know how public lands work or anything like that. So can you kind of give a little background on, for people that may not know how public lands work and how people can access them?
Sure, I can try. I mean, you'll hear a lot in the sporting community talk about Teddy Roosevelt, right? Because he's kind of the godfather of all of this, right? He recognized that this is that this was something that was unique to the United States, that we needed to conserve this stuff, right? So I pulled this up because I want to make sure I get the numbers right. But under his presidency, he protected roughly 230 million acres. So essentially, a third of what we know is public lands right now. He started.
Oh wow.
He doubled the national park system in his time. He created multiple national monuments. He created 150 national forests, a bunch of different national wildlife refuges, all the things we know as public lands right now, right? And he also is kind of one of the godfathers of this multiple use sustained yield kind of concept, meaning that these public lands will be there to use in many different ways, and we need to sustain them in perpetuity, right? So you might be able to get timber over here, and you might do wilderness over here, and you might be able to have a mine over here, but over here we're going to have a wildlife refuge because it's really important to the critters. So those kinds of things were kind of the basis for our public land system now. So when we talk about the BLM, they're about 250 million acres. So that's a big chunk of our, public land system. The Forest Service is 193 million acres. Those are the two big ones. And we have the Park Service, which, in places like Alaska, you're talking millions of acres again. And then there's some smaller parks as well. But all of those are places that are public for all of us to use. They have different mandates. The Park Service is more of a preservation type mandate, right? Try to keep it exactly as it is in perpetuity, more of an ecosystem, preservation type of model. BLM tends to be more of a place where you'll have a lot more grazing and mining and resource extraction, right? And the Forest Service was originally about timber, but it's become so much more, right? That's where a lot of our wilderness is. That's where a lot of our drinking water comes from, our clean drinking water, and then things like wildlife habitat and other things have kind of come up as really important values that we need to maintain within all of those things. But, all Americans and even non-Americans, right? Anybody can come to these lands and use them, right? Like here in Colorado where I live, I know multiple places. I just drive up a forest road. I can, there's little spur roads. You go over there and you camp. You just pop a tent up or whatever. That is unique and special, right? And it's that's something I just can't hit home hard enough with, is that is very unique. It's not, we kind of take it for granted because we have it. But with that privilege, I'm really starting to promote the idea of an obligation to know what's going on in those, to take care of them, to speak up. That's what we're certainly asking people to do with this Senate bill. And this isn't over, right? Like there's a guy, Randy Newberg, probably a lot of your listeners have heard, and he uses the quote, "It's the largest unowned concentration of wealth on the planet, is these 650 million acres," right? Imagine what that timber's worth, what that water's worth, what all those resources worth. There's going to be people that are trying to go get that wealth, but it's all of ours. And so we need to maintain that for the enjoyment of the American people.
Yeah. So speaking on the wealth and just the wealth of resources there is, some people are talking about, okay, well, they can, drill here and they can, harvest timber here and the implications it could be for like how much money we can go, have going back to our deficit and stuff like that. So speaking on like selling federal public lands or federal lands in general. So there's other lands that can be sold. For instance, there's retired military bases that haven't had anybody on them in 40 years that are within a city. And people are talking about, well, affordable housing. Well, I feel like areas like that could definitely be way better suited for affordable housing. Take a defunct army base or military base, and if it's not being used and nothing's being stored there, then why not sell that off to the local municipality, and they can build a community center, they can build affordable housing. It's going to be closer to the municipalities, the water, the electricity, and stuff like that. So it's going to have such a cheaper footprint to even get going in the first place, and it just seems like better fit for the bill for that. But I haven't seen really anybody talking about that, and so just talking on alternatives, is that anything that you and Gabe Vasquez talked about when he was on your show?
No, not really. It's a bit of a different place, right? There's a lot of different affordable housing advocates, right? There's a lot of people who know how to develop cities and do those kinds of things, get transportation near them, get the sewer and water and electricity. Emergency services is one, we think about in my county, right? The more houses you get out in the woods, how long does it take for the sheriff to show up? If a wildfire starts, what's the emergency response? Those kinds of things. So affordable housing, just as a matter of fact, tends to be more concentrated housing. You need smaller units, you need condensed housing on a smaller footprint. That kind of thing needs to be hooked up to city services in general, right? It's not a septic and a sewer type of a situation.
Right.
You don't want it way out in the hinterlands where there's no, public transportation, things like that, because you're kind of creating problems that you were trying to solve, right? If you need affordable housing but now you need to drive 10 miles to work as opposed to walk or bike or drive very short distances, well, that increases your expense. So it kind of negates some of the affordable housing issues, right? So I don't want to speak out of turn a little bit because I'm not an affordable housing expert by any means, but I think even the layperson like you and I can kind of see that, like, if you put it way out there, it doesn't add up. And come to any of these Western communities and look at the houses that are in those hills. They're not typically the affordable housing type of a house. So that's probably not who's going to buy it. And one of the requirements in this bill is fair market value. Well, those lands are going to be expensive land. That's not the kind of land you would typically target for creating an affordable development.
Exactly. So you live, like you said, in a smaller town, kind of out in the sticks in that area. So I'm sure you have a very strong relationship with the land. Do you have any stories that you'd be willing to share on how it's affected your life, changed your life in any way, having this relationship with the lands or your kids or anything like that?
Absolutely. I mean, my kids, my son harvested one of his first elk, like right over the hill, that to me, for our family, we care about hunting very deeply. And, my whole family came and helped pack it out. My wife and daughter came, right. And then we packed out the elk the second day. And, that's something I'll never forget. We were all joyous, right? Like we butcher our own meat. We spend time together, cutting it up and cooking it. And that's something that's really important to our family, that we spend a lot of time together, and every time we eat that elk wood, that's different. That's not like buying something from the store. That is every bite. I remember my legs burning. I remember the moment we first saw that elk. I remember our elation and, and all the emotions that go with harvesting an animal like that. And I see the product of, my kid is born and he grows up and he falls in love with these things. And then one of the culminations of that is him harvesting his first animal and the pride he took in that and the work he did to get to that place and the work we did together, and that being a father for that moment. Like, you can't take that away. That's something that's one of the best things in my entire life. And that all happened on public lands. And I try to look and say, if I didn't have public lands, what would that be like? I have no idea, and so it would literally be taking out a huge chunk of my life. And I don't know what it would be filled with. And I don't think it would be as good as that, though. I just really don't. I think it's one of the best most pure things you can do is just get out in the woods and take a hike and camp and watch the stars. And it's far better than most alternatives in my mind. Especially, we talked a little bit about kids being on screens too much, and all of the other
Yeah.
things like that. That has mental health implications and lots of issues. That just being outside takes care of a lot of it.
Yeah, it definitely does. And my youngest is 7 years old, and I took her out hunting. This is the first year she went out hunting. We went out turkey hunting, we went out deer hunting, and just seeing the joy in her eyes as we're walking through. And I only hunt public lands. I don't know anybody here that has private lands that allows me to hunt. So everything that I do is on public land. And I took her out. The first time I took her out, we went deer hunting last season, and we're just walking through the woods. It's a little bit chilly outside. She's covered up in her oversized camo jacket, and just walking. And I have a little doe bleak can, and we didn't harvest anything because she's sitting there just using that thing, and just seeing the joy on her face, though, that we're just like literally out there in the middle of nowhere, and we're close to the Saline River here in Arkansas. And so you hear the river flowing. You got, just nature all around you. There's no screens, or we weren't on the phone. Like, she's not talking about YouTube videos or anything. She's just admiring everything that was out there. And it was kind of still and quiet. It was cold and it was winter. And then so this spring I took her out turkey hunting, and once again we didn't harvest anything. She's a little wiggle worm, but just the amount of birds that were around, and she's just out there. Of course I gave her my slate call, and she's out there trying to call on a slate call, and found out that she can actually use a box call far better. She can use a slate call. So just out there teaching her how to try to communicate with these birds. And it was funny because we had an owl nearby that she would hear, and it would almost like return like to the turkey. And
Yeah.
it was just all sorts of stuff going on, just wildlife in general, that she was just completely encapsulated and surrounded by nature. She just loved it. And seeing the joy on her face out there was far better than seeing her laughing at a YouTube video inside, or on a phone, or on a screen. And there's just a deeper connection that humans have with nature than not being out in nature. And just to know that these public lands could be taken from us and not even voted on, or by the public, or not even getting public input, is just a major issue. So if there's anybody out there that doesn't recreate outside, and you just don't fully understand, just try to find some testimonies online, and try to get a feel for how people actually do relate and connect with nature due to public lands.
Yeah, that was a great way to say it. I mean, those things you just mentioned with your daughter, she'll never forget those things. She'll remember those when she's 70 years old. She'll be thinking, that time with my dad, the first times I ever did that.
Yeah.
When I talk about it, I literally almost get verklempt, because I think of all those same moments with my kids, right? And what it's meant to our family. And, it's like you're kind of stealing part of our history if you take some of these places. And some of the places that we've been are definitely, in that available for sale category. Some of the places that are very near and dear to us. So you're literally talking about robbing memories from us in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So, you said it well. I mean, there's a reason, one of the things I talk about with hunting, it connects us to every person who ever walked the earth, until, fairly recently when people stopped hunting. But up until not that long ago, every person on earth, them or their people hunted and harvested and wild foraged. And we love getting mushrooms every year and looking for mushrooms and bringing those home and cooking them, berries, all those things. We're connecting to all of our ancestors, to every person that ever walked the earth. And as we lose public lands and we lose these traditions, those things go away. Right. And it's something that I hope we never lose.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm just being tied back to our roots is just something just so primal within humanity. And unfortunately, hunters' numbers are dwindling, and I don't think it's a far stretch to say that someday, a lot of these traditions and memories might be gone. But if we can try to preserve them for as long as we can, I think we should.
Not on our watch. We're going to keep
right. Absolutely. So speaking on history and stuff, so history shows that public pressure, works. That, earlier this year in May, 100,000 outdoor enthusiasts sent letters to Congress helping remove a sell-off amendment Hunters and anglers can also join organizations like the National Wildlife Federation, Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, Back County Hunters and Anglers, and they can amplify their voice. So what are some practical steps that you would suggest to our listeners, hunters and anglers and hikers, who want to make a difference on these public land issues?
And the simplest way right now is you got to call your senators. Senators are hearing about this every day. We've heard from Senate offices like, "Wow, we don't even know where this came from. We weren't aware this was this big of a deal." In Idaho, we just saw Senators Crapo and Risch come out just 2 days ago and say, "Hey, we're not going to vote for this because of the pressure we're feeling." That even if you're not in a public land state, particularly in the sporting community, I think we understand that as much as anyone, right? Because everybody in Indiana or Arkansas or Florida that's a hunter dreams of that big game Western hunt, right? Like that's what people want to do. Yeah. And they've been there probably, or they're trying to get there. So it matters to you too, right? So you can call your senator, right? And just mechanically, the Republicans have the majority, so we need more Republican senators right now. But like I said, it's a bipartisan issue. Call all your senators. Make sure that they're feeling it, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, that we're not going for this, right? And they don't like that pressure. They don't like getting calls every day and having their staff ask them about it and what are we doing and how are we going to, fix this and those kinds of things. So they need to hear that pressure. There's a general number for calling Congress. I can tell you if you want to hear it. It's 202-224-3121, 202-224-3121. You call there and you can ask for any senator. If you formerly lived in a state that had public lands, that you can call up and say, "Hey, I used to live there. I love these places. They mattered to me. I ask that you vote no for this." That's the simplest thing, is just direct advocacy. If your senator is having a town hall, we're hearing there could be a vote as early as this week. So maybe it's null and void this time. But if they're having a town hall in the future, illuminating public lands as a value that you care about as a constituent every single time they show up in one of these places, it becomes an issue. If you look in this bill, Montana is carved out, right? Because Montanans were so loud and proud about public lands that Steve Daines and Tim Sheehy said, the senators there said, we're not going to do this. And so Senator Lee in Utah, who's running this piece of legislation, carved that out. And Montanans are still on the phone saying, "Hey, that doesn't fix it for you guys. We didn't mean just Montana public lands. We meant all public lands. So we still need you to vote no." And they're feeling that pressure. And like I said, a lot of folks are feeling the pressure, and we're close. If we keep putting this pressure on, we're going to defeat this bad piece of legislation.
Absolutely.
But there's other.
And again, that number is 202-224-3121. And like you said, just call, speak to a senator and say, "Hey, I'm a constituent and I'm asking you to vote no on this." If you have a story or testimony you want to tell them, leave it in voicemail, anything like that. Write a letter in. I'll have a link in the description that you can click on that'll give you information on how to get a hold of your senator. You can put in where you live or where you visited, and it'll give you for that location who the senators are, how you can contact them. You can write a letter, you can call, anything like that. Anything helps. And I know Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is doing something on Wednesday the 25th where they want 25,000 people to call the switchboard of the Capitol. So if you're listening to this, call that number, ask for a senator, and just give them your mind and say, "Hey, this is not happening. I'm a constituent and we do not want this to happen. We're asking you to vote no."
You got it. That's a great thing. And I would extend it a bit. What I was about to say is that don't let this be the last time, right? Hopefully we win this, but as we talked about, take that obligation, on a Tuesday night when you're going to just sit and watch TV. Instead, maybe look up what you can do to help your local piece of ground, participate in the cleanup. There's fence removal projects. A lot of the agency folks would sit down with you and have coffee and tell you about what the issues are and, what they're facing and what kind of resources they need. They need volunteers. They need people who care. If you're an expert in some sort of a field, maybe it's technical, maybe it's like technology, maybe it's wildlife, right? You can go offer that in your community setting. You can bring other people out. We know in our hunting and angling community, one of the big things is getting other people out. So we were recruiting the next generations. Even if you don't hunt or fish, you could take someone hiking, show them that cool rock, that cool tree, that cool bird. Get them engaged, get them invested. We need nature. We need public lands. It's a part of what makes us human. And it's really critical we keep that opportunity for us. It's a national value. It's a worldly value, right? Nobody should be absent of this. Unfortunately, some are, but we can influence that in our country because we're a democracy, and we can keep that alive. And so I think just there's really no kind of sideboards to what you can do. It's education. It's talking about it. It's hosting a movie night where, right, you're showing a movie that's about amazing public lands and saying, hey, who wants to go there? Let's plan a trip next year. There's national parks. You can donate to national parks. You can do things like that. They need resources to manage these areas. Don't let it stop with just making this call. This is a true treasure, a true privilege. Take care of these places. Realize the value that they have and the amazing resource they are for us all.
Absolutely. Get out there and recreate. Take somebody with you, because history shows that if you do something that you love, you're going to take care of it. So take somebody out there. Maybe they'll find a new passion and they're going to help take care of it. And the more of us that are working on it, the better it's going to be. So.
You got it.
Yes, sir. Well, I appreciate your time, and there was a lot of helpful information in here. So yeah, I think this is a good place to stop it. I couldn't find a better way to do it. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for hopping on. And those of y'all that are listening, we'll catch y'all next time.
This has been Wildlife Outdoors. Thanks for listening. Follow us on Facebook at Wildlife Outdoors and on Instagram at wild.life.outdoors. Let's go live life on the wild side.